is to come and talk to you. And I have had so many good times laughing at Mr. Peterman. So I know that he's done so much more. He is a musician and a triple threat and the voiceover for many cartoons and many different things, an MC. And I'm going to turn it over to him, and he...
New York Times bestselling author.
Yes, and a new CD. Is this on? Yeah, this is very loud. All right, so John and Earl.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome and that very nice introduction. As Mark Twain once said, the trouble with a good introduction is that it never really goes far enough. And so, with your permission, I'm going to begin again and reintroduce myself. Ladies and gentlemen, he was the man who killed Seinfeld. In a career that began more than 30 years ago with a badly lip-synced version of The Yellow Rose of Texas for a KTEL record commercial of Mitch Miller's greatest hits. Since then, he's managed to kill 3 series of his own. 4 soap operas. He's guest starred on more than 15 television shows. Not one is still on the air. And during sweeps, the golden week in television ratings, he managed to take not 1, not 2, but 3 shows off the air in 1 week. Alan Seinfeld and Damon, ladies and gentlemen, the Grim Reaper of television. I wanted to talk to you today before we begin a little question and answer session. And I wanted to begin and share something with you that is so extraordinarily important to me to pass on. I knew at the age of 3 years old what I wanted to do with my life. There was no surprise at all. People would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up. With the sense of disgust that only a 3-year-old can muster, I would put my hands on my hips, and I would point to the little black and white television in the corner of the living room, and I would say, well, I am an actor, so that's what I'm going to be. And the fact that nobody understood that was a sense of disgust for me. And I always defined myself, even in my early years, as an actor. I remember stealing the portable black and white television set. Portable because it only weighed 40 pounds. And I would take it up to my bedroom at night. I would stick it under the covers, plug it in, put the little antennas out there, and I would get a UHF signal, which none of you know what it means anymore. And I was able to get the NBC station, and at 11:30 at night I would watch the Johnny Carson show. A man who's gone on, but set the stride for what late night talk shows would be. And I watched it every single night, and I remember being 10 years old, and I remember one particular night, because as I was watching this, it was my attachment to entertainment. All the actors would come on, and Johnny would interview them, and they would all have these wonderful stories. And I remember so succinctly walking around the room during a commercial break with the same hands on my hips, in a flurry, wondering what I was going to tell him when I finally got on The Tonight Show. Because I didn't have any stories. And so we cut to a while later to the first time that I was on The Tonight Show. And sadly, Johnny had gone, and Jay Leno was there. And I remember with my hands on either side of the chair next to Jay, and I remember during a commercial break, he leaned over to me, and he said, "You okay?" And I said, "Yes, I am. I'm just saying hi to a 10-year-old kid." It's been a life of self-definition for me to be an actor. It was never a choice. It was always what I was. But it wasn't until 1991, June 21st, I remember this night very succinctly because it was a night that I met a man that kind of changed my life. I was on a cruise ship and we were cruising through the Arctic Circle on the longest day of the year, the summer solstice where the sun never sets, north of Iceland. Of course we are, I'm Jay Peterman. And that night, as I was talking to this gentleman that was a little older than 70 years old, and he was just this wonderful man that I had met on the cruise, I just found this man to be one of the most engaging people that I had ever met. And he was an extraordinarily successful man, a millionaire many times over, and I'm probably cheating him by a couple of decimal points when I say that. But I asked him one night, that particular night, what it was that he had done to make himself such a success. And he said something to me that I've always remembered. He grabbed my arm, and he leaned over to me, and with a little twinkle in his eyes, he said, "John, you got two choices in life. You can have an ordinary life, or you can have an extraordinary life." And he said, "That's it." And he says it has nothing to do with money, it has nothing to do with power, it has everything to do with the power of your choices. I thought about that deeply, and I said something to him 4 or 5 days later when I left the cruise. And it's something I only said to maybe 10 people in my life. And I said, "I will know you for the rest of my life." And I did. Sadly, it was too soon. He passed away from leukemia about 5 years later. But he left me with a sort of GPS for my life. I've always wanted to live an interesting, and more importantly, an extraordinary life. And so I thought about it, and I've thought about this every day ever since. I've written about it, I speak about it. And I've organized a mode of thought into what I believe the extraordinary life is. And what I want to pass on to you today, before we get into questions and answers, is the first and the most important element of it. And that is imagination. Imagination is the key to everything. It is the fundamental aspect of the extraordinary life. And I'll tell you why. Your imagination are the little pictures in your mind. It's the daydreams. Everybody tells you stop daydreaming. You've been told this all your life as you've been students. Stop looking out the window. I'm going to tell you the exact opposite. Daydream as much as you possibly can. Let those pictures filter through that part of you, those wonderful impressions, paintings that you can't make sense of, but they just keep coming back to you about who you are, what you want to be, what you value. Your next step on the dance floor, the way you're going to approach a role that you've been given, the notes that you sing, and how you sing them. Your imagination is the most important thing inside you, and the reason I make it so fundamental is that it doesn't lie to you. Your rational mind will lie to you. It knows fear, it has an agenda, it knows everything, and will keep you from doing things. But your imagination cannot lie to you. And I have listened to my imagination all of my adult life. I just didn't realize that that's what I was doing. And it was until I met this man that I realized how fundamental it was. Because imagination is everything. The saddest tragedy in life is that the greatest ideas lie in the minds of people who think that everybody has a better idea than they do. I'll say it again. The greatest tragedy in life is the fact that these great ideas lie inside of people who think that everybody has a better idea than they do. And they don't. You do. But you have to begin by valuing what you imagine. And I mean that. And it sounds like it's so simple, but how often have you heard people say, "Well, that's a great idea and I'll probably get around to it someday, but it's just, I can't do it now." And so ultimately, these wonderful ideas, these images out of your imagination, lie there on the 5-yard line and they never get across the goal. And that's why I say the greatest tragedy in life is that the greatest ideas still lie in the minds of people who thought that everybody had a better idea than they did. I want to begin and say again that what you imagine has value. You have to begin by valuing your imagination. And every time you devalue what you imagine, you take another step towards an ordinary life. Because I really believe, as I discovered it, as I've gone through life and I've met people, that we don't choose ordinary lives. Nobody wants to be George Costanza. Nobody wants to be there swinging from the middle rung on the ladder of life. Eternally mediocre. Nobody wants to be there in the meaty part of the bell curve. I see it in my son's eyes. I've got a 7-year-old son, and everything he does is this wonderful sense of leaping. He can't take 3 steps at a time. He wants to take 4. Every stick he holds becomes a sword, it becomes a jousting spear, it becomes a fishing rod, because he believes, like his father does, that every single body of water in the world, even the puddle at the end of the driveway, will hold a fish. But somewhere there is a disconnect, and it happens at some point in life. And so I want to catch you at this important time of your life when you are still molding where you are going. And to tell you that you have to value what you imagine. It is the first step towards living extraordinarily. When you begin that, you begin taking the step towards living an extraordinary life. My own path was a rather curious one. I studied as much as I possibly could because I wanted to be as well trained as I possibly could. But unfortunately, somebody had told me when I was 12 years old that I had the worst voice they'd ever heard. So I stopped singing for 6 years. I wouldn't open my mouth again. And it wasn't until I went to college, I went to Providence College up in Rhode Island, that I found a music teacher there who had to literally kick and scream and drag a voice out of me. And now I make my living, pretty much 7 nights a week, singing somewhere or in some fashion. When I was 12 years old, I also had the greatest sense of stage fright that you have ever heard. I was afraid to be on stage, and yet I defined myself as an actor. When I was 12 years old, we were reading a play one day in our English class, and I went to an all-boys school. And so it wasn't very cool to put any sort of characterization into your reading. It just wasn't a thing you did. You just read it and got out of there. Well, I figured this was my moment. And so I put some characterization behind what I was doing. And after class, the teacher said to me, he says, "John, would you stay after? I want to talk to you." And I went, "Oh boy. Oh boy." And so I stayed after, and he said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "I thought you read really, really well." And he said, "What I'd really like you to do is go down to the theater department there and talk to Mr. Best, the head of the theater. And I want you to audition for the next play." And I did. And I got the lead in the play. But I want to tell you that was the first time I was ever encouraged in my life. And it was also the last time I needed it. And I think back to all of the things that teachers have said to me and to others. I think the saddest part about being in the teaching profession is that often you never get to see the fruits of the seeds that you sow. I went back years and years later to the school that I graduated from in high school. And the New York Times was doing an article on, just at the end of Seinfeld, and they were doing a story on the success of the show, and they were there and interviewing me because I was speaking at the school. And sadly, Mr. Driscoll had left years and years before. And I mentioned how fundamentally important that one passing moment, that one teacher had the courtesy to say to me, "For that one moment in time, you were pretty good. Keep it going." And I said, "That man doesn't know the door that he opened to me." Well, they took that. New York Times, the interviewer, took that and ran with the story. And they went and found him. And oddly enough, he was out on Long Island teaching at another prep school. He has since passed away, sadly. But they did interview him. And they said, "Did you know, you remember this student? And do you remember what you said to him and how it encouraged him so much?" He hadn't a clue who I was. In vague memory, and had to kind of sit there, and he goes, "You know, I don't remember saying anything to him, but I'm pretty sure he would have discovered it on his own. That's the humility of a good teacher. And it underscores the great work that they do, and I say this to them as much as I say it to you. As you begin to cultivate this thing, this imagination, value what you do, I also challenge the people that are teaching you to reward you with a sense of encouragement, because that is what will propel you to the next level, as it did to me. When I graduated from college, I was the only graduate my senior year in theater. So consequently, I won the theater award. But something very strange happened. The day of graduation, I turned like a deer in the headlights, and I realized I knew what I was doing as an actor. I had no idea how I was going to make a living at it. I didn't have anybody in my family that was ever in the entertainment at all. Our college didn't graduate any actors, aside from me. So we had no alumni to fall back on. So all of a sudden I realized that I had a stone wall in front of me. I didn't know what I was going to do. And so I limped back home, and I went and I lived with my parents for 5 years. And I went into public relations, which was the most theatrical thing I could think of outside the theater. And I was moving along in that career, but I gotta tell you something. During that time, my imagination dried up. I had no dreams. The only night dreams I had were having fistfights, which was certainly a common element of being frustrated with something. But it was one of the strangest times of my life because my imagination was gone, because I'd lost my sense of my self-definition. I was an actor, and that's what I was going to be. I got a phone call one day when I was at my desk at my work at the time, and I heard the voice of one of my dearest friends that I had grown up with. It was his mother. And I didn't quite understand what she was saying, but through her tears, I could make out the fact that he had been killed the night before in a horrific automobile accident. And during the week that followed, which was such a difficult time for me, as you can well imagine, for anybody it is, during that week that followed was an enormous epiphany for me. Because I realized this guy that had just passed away was living an extraordinary life. He had never given up on the dreams, and he was one of the most imaginative people. He was a three letters athlete in high school and college. 4.0 student. He was at medical school and sadly was killed his first year in med school. And that night the world lost a very good doctor. But in order to have this tragedy make some meaning for me, I had to come out the victor some way. And that was the week that I decided that I was not being true to myself. And so I made a plan to return to New York. And I sculpted out a plan that I was going to study again, get my skills back up to what I felt they needed to be, both musically and as an actor. And every weekend I would take the train from Connecticut into New York. And I would do this for 1 year, and I promised that the first week of September in 1981 that I was going to be in New York. And I kept to that promise, and I was there 52 weekends in New York, taking every acting class I could, taking every music class I could. And I arrived in New York in 1981. My parents dropped me off at the Hotel Lucerne on 79th and Amsterdam. Today, it is a $1 million condominium. It was a single-room occupancy hotel when I was there. For $80 a week, I shared a bathroom that had a curtain that looked like a bad bruise. I had a king-size bed, a quarter of which was missing. I can't explain any more than that. A quarter of it was missing, as though someone had taken a large bite out of it. And they didn't bother to change the bed, they just made the sheets over the quarter that was missing. It was filled with the roaches that you would imagine. But it was home for me in New York. And I remember my parents parents driving away, and I had everything in the world. I had in 2 suitcases. And I had just resigned from a very promising career in public relations. It was a rainy night as I watched them drive down 79 towards the West Side Highway and heading up home. And it was that moment in my life when I realized what I had done. I had taken the largest leap of my life in hopes that the net would appear. And I remember sitting down on my bed that night and weeping openly because of the consequences of the decision I had just made. 48 hours later, I had my first show in New York. For no other reason than I happened to walk up the wrong way on a fire escape at lunch. A friend of mine was doing a play called Eternal Love. This was the first day of rehearsals. And I walked up there to meet her for lunch, and I banged on the fire door as they were leaving, and I poked my head in, and she said, "Come on over here quickly." She said they just fired the second lead in the show. This was their first day of rehearsals. He looks just like you. She dragged me over to the producers and said, "What do you think of him? Let's sing him. Let's put him through the paces and maybe he can do this." So by the end of lunch, I had my first show in New York. So when people ask me, how did you become, I said, I don't know. Try walking up a fire escape the wrong way. It worked for me. But I have been blessed ever since. I've been lucky enough to always make my living as an actor. It's brought me some of the greatest joys of my life. And it was shortly after doing that first play that I discovered television, and I started in the original soap operas. Back in the heyday of the 80s when soaps were the #1 shows on television. And I started on The Edge of Night. I finished there and killed that show. ABC moved me over to Loving, a show that lasted all the 80s and into the 90s, where I actually played the first twin brothers on daytime television. And from there I moved on to a few other shows, Young and Restless, All My Children, and a few others. And then I discovered that if you moved to the west coast of California, you could take the Decimal Point and move it 1 spot over. And so I did, and I went out there, and that's when I discovered nighttime television and film, and kind of kept me going from there. But it was my love of the theater that always brought me back. I love the theater. It is the most engaging thing for me. Every night you get to take a character at 8 o'clock on a journey. He has a beginning, he has a middle, and he has an end. And you've got to follow him through that arc. And once that conductor's baton drops, there's no such thing as take 2. And as you know, because you're all performers in this room, you have to bring your A game to that. So you have to be prepared. But it has brought me some of the greatest joys of my life, and I love continuing in the theater. Yes, I will return to television. I'm in the middle of doing a film right now. In fact, somebody tweeted out one of the bald shots of me recently. I don't know how many of you saw that, but I'm actually doing a film where I'm bald right now. It's not a pretty picture. So I want to end for just a second there and take your questions, as you may have them. And I'll answer anything you like. Anything at all about my misspent youth.
How does it feel performing on tour rather than as
Good question. I mean, this was public. There are two completely different entities. On Broadway, a show like Chicago has been running. It's the longest running American musical in history, in American history. I tend to think of it as more, for the audience, it's more of an appointment. That they're there to see 4 shows in the week and go to 2:30 show in the evening. So it's a different type of audience, and many times they don't speak English. So you're dealing with a worldly audience. It's a different reaction than when you go out on tour. And the fun of being on tour is you get to come to cities that you wouldn't ordinarily go to, perhaps. You get to do things like I'm doing right now. Engage yourself with people that are just learning about what you do. And most importantly, is, and this is what keeps it fun, is that you have an open night and have a closing. We open on Tuesday, we'll close on Sunday. We have a great time, the tension and the excitement of being here is so much fun. And then when you have to wrap everything up Sunday night, you're sad to leave, but you know that you have to hop on the plane and continue to be the gypsy that you want. It's part of the thing that we love about the business, is that we just move as kind of a ragtag militia from city to city. But it's a very, very enjoyable thing, and I encourage any of you that ever have the opportunity to do it, please do it. It's a wonderful, wonderful way to see this wonderful country. I've seen cities and learned things that I never would have learned. Yes? Yes?
What do you think is the biggest difference between acting for television as opposed to acting on stage?
Well, when you're on television, all of this space doesn't matter. The only thing that does matter is that little black hole that's right above he's texting it, right? That little black hole is the only thing that matters. And it's a very difficult thing for an actor to learn, because you have to realize you have to let the camera do its work. You don't have to explain to the camera. All you have to do is what you do. You focus on the eyes of the other person, and you do your work. That's it. When you're on stage, you have to have a thing called presence. And this is what separates film actors from stage actors. When I walk out on stage, I need you to see that I'm important. If you don't, I have failed the playwright, and I failed myself as an actor. On television, the camera will make you important. They'll record the scene, 3 or 4 cameras, they'll be around, they'll pick up shots from behind you, they'll pick up shots everywhere. You'll do a scene 4 or 5 times on a sitcom. You'll have a small audience of maybe 200 people there to provide somewhat of a theatrical experience. When you're doing a film, you have one camera. Then they'll move that camera. And they'll come in for close-ups. And what they're doing is gathering all of this material that they will eventually dump onto an editor's desk, and he will put all the work together. So the difference between television and theater, it's a very good question, is that television and film are editors' mediums. They're not actors' mediums. I could produce a great television show or a great film with any one of you that had never acted before, just by getting you to say something the way I want you to say it and recording it. I could go word by word. I had to do that once with another actress that I was supposed to be doing this pilot with. And I said, this is just ridiculous. Let me tell her how to say the line. And so they created the entire pilot out of me just saying, right, say it like this. Look at me like this. Now turn to me and say it like that. They had to go back and just piece together a performance, but they were able to do it. You can't do that on stage. I saw one of the great contemporary, I won't tell you her name, but I saw one of the great contemporary film actresses of our time on stage on Broadway within the last 5 years. She was their star, and it was sold out. And ran on for about 8 weeks. I went to see her, and I thought I was watching a bad high school production. She was bent over, she had absolutely no command, and absolutely no presence at all. And I said, isn't that interesting? That somebody so famous for her film work doesn't have the presence, doesn't have the voice, doesn't have the command to be in a large space. Very interesting. Good question. Yes?
My name is Luciana.
Luciana?
Luciana.
Luciana.
Yes. Being in Seinfeld was probably one of the biggest elements that gave you a bigger name. How do you feel about that, and what makes you feel better about yourself performing on stage and performing for the camera?
Well, I like them both. Ultimately, I like the stage better. I just enjoy the idea of taking a character on a 2.5-hour journey. And I also, a show like, especially like Chicago, when I know something that the audience doesn't know, that when we start that show, we're all beginning from the point of innocence. But I know that when 10:30 rolls around, that they're going to be on their feet, cheering, and we are going to have a great time. And that's the joy of doing such a wonderful thing. I can't promise that on television, and I certainly can't promise that on the show. But I can always promise that on the theater. And that's what I enjoy about it. In terms of Jay Peterman, I was lucky enough to be arguably one of the great television shows in history. And we knew it when we were on it. And it's a little bit like having the final exam and having been given the questions beforehand. That's how I felt. And I used to say to everyone who was hired as an extra or an assistant for me in the Peterman office or the boardroom or any other scene that we had, I would say, I want you to do one thing for me. I want you to keep the script. I want you to make notes. I want you to remember what you wore, who you talked to, and your entire impressions of everything that went on. I want you to keep that script as a diary of this next week that you're going to be here. Because I promise you, you're going to be watching the show with your grandchildren. I said, I can't make that promise about any other television show at this point, I'll tell you. You will. So for me, it was a great opportunity. And one of the great things about Seinfeld for me was the writing was so spectacular. We had the best writers, and you never got to see all the fun stuff that we did. Because the show was always 10 minutes too long. And the first thing they did was say, well, just cut the Peterman long. And so consequently, I tried not to watch the show. I always remembered it as a theatrical experience the way we did it, with all the other dialogue still in it, because it was a lot funnier and a lot richer experience as well. Every week they would cut the Peterman monologue, and I'll give you an example of one of the ones that they cut. It was in the Friars Club episode when Rob Schneider was playing my hard of hearing assistant. And I thought that he and Elaine were having a little tete-a-tete on office time. And so I decided I was going to play Cupid and encourage her. So I walk into her office with 2 tickets to the circus. I slap them down on her desk and I tell her that she and Bob can knock off a little early to get ready. And she looked at me as though I wrote a second ahead. And this was the monologue that they cut from the show. She says, Bob. And I said, Elaine, don't worry, I too am no stranger to love on the block. As a young lad, my father apprenticed me to a honey factory in Belize. The chief beekeeper was this horrible hag of a woman with narrow teeth and a giant wart that she called her nose. She was not attractive even by backward standards. And all was turning on Elaine, and as the days went on, working closer and closer together, that sweet smell of honey in the air, I knew I had to have that horrible creature. And I did, so we could all have a good time. To actually buy the Seinfeld DVDs, I went back and recorded that so that it's there. Everyone will see it. That's one of the standing jokes of Seinfeld. Having that moment. And redo it. Another question? Yes.
From a business and professional standpoint, is there one thing that you wish you knew going into TV and film acting? Is there one thing? If there's one thing you wish you knew going into it before you started it, what would it be?
I didn't quite understand if there's one more.
If there was one thing you wish you knew going into film and commercials, TV, professionally, what would it be?
I think it took me a while to understand the nature of acting on television. It really did, because again, I had grown up with this example of acting being large and theatrical. And not allowing, as I said before, the camera to do its work. And I wish I had had more experience in that, but I didn't. I certainly didn't have it in college. And I had to learn it the hard way in my training down in New York. And I found it, the first TV show that I did, The Edge of Night, I found myself crazy by trying to figure out what I do in this space, and forgetting that all I was supposed to be doing was really just working with that person and letting that character does because it's a different type of medium. It's almost like, it's the difference between talking and having a voyeur there. You have to realize that the television camera is really just a voyeur. It's somebody who's watching. And you have to let their voyeurism not affect the jury. You understand what I mean? Yeah, it's a very, very, very difficult medium to understand the difference between it until you do it, practice it over and over again, and you become comfortable with it. It's a foreign object. Good question. Well, voiceovers are, it's almost too much fun and it shouldn't be considered work. What I love about doing voiceovers, and I have about 15 cartoons that I do or have done. The ones that I keep a bunch of them alive right now. One is SpongeBob. I do King Neptune and SpongeBob, and then I'm also at Disney's #1 show is Phineas and Ferb. I don't know if you've ever watched it, but I think it's one of the funniest. It's basically what I think of is Seinfeld for kids. The funniest, most imaginative series, and I have a 7-year-old who loves to watch the series, and whether I'm on it or not, I can sit and just for hours watch the show. It is so inventive and so wholesomely creative for the kids. It just is such a fun thing, and the two guys that created are two of the greatest guys I know in the business. And what I love about voice acting is that it gives you a chance to be larger than life. Because all it is the sound. It's really, so you have to bring this character, so everything has to be important. And you need a core to your voice. Because that's the thing that really drives the character. And because I happen to have cornered the market on arrogance and pomposity in my career, I get to play all of the kings and the mayors and the presidents and all of that stuff down the line. And usually they're villains of some sort who always get their comeuppance at the end. But I love doing it, and also just for the simple facility of it. It is so simple to do. I could be any. I remember being in London once and recording on an ISDN line back in LA. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are. You can do it anywhere. It's the greatest thing in the world. And as we develop the technology on our little iPhones, I'm sure I'll be able to just do it from my iPhone and send it as a file. But I enjoy the voice work is just so much fun. And it's fun for me too, because as a father with a 7-year-old, it's important for me to develop a body of work that is something that's accessible to him. Consequently, not only accessible to him, but accessible to his friends. And that's really important to me. I really, because it's important that I don't want my son to have to wait 20 years to be old enough to really appreciate what I've done as an actor, or not appreciate what I've done as an actor. By then it might be considered the old black and white. We think of the old Jackie Gleason show, we'll probably regard Seinfeld like that as well. Questions? Yes?
So it sounds like your first job kind of just landed in your lap, but from that point on, did you get most of your jobs by networking or by auditioning?
Most always, very few were by network.
Okay.
Most, and because in my first part of my career I was in New York City, they all came through an agent's office. And an agent is extraordinarily important. So are being the unions. I was lucky enough in that first miserable show that I was in to have gotten an agent out of it and get into the unions. But all of my work came, I wouldn't say networking really ever came into play at all. It was always audition for the very first half of my career. And then as I started to develop a bit of a name, then people started to know what I did, and you could kind of move from show to show at that point. But and to this day, especially for films, I still go in and I read. And a lot of it for my own comfort level. I almost hate the idea of getting a role that I haven't read for, because I want to feel the same comfort level that I'm working at the level of expectation of the director and the producers. There's nothing more uncomfortable than walking onto the set for the first day and they say, "Oh, we're so glad you're here. Oh, sit down." And then you open your mouth and they go, "Yeah, that was great. That was really really great. And so I enjoy the aspect of auditioning. I really do. It's a lot of fun for me. It's like going in and trying to solve their dilemma for them. That's the way I look at it. Audition is nothing more than solving an employment problem for them. It really is. They're not there to tell you no. They're there to say, oh, you saved my life. And you have to look at it. No question?
Did you get the same agent in New York as LA?
No. I have gone through many agents and several mismanagers. Mismanagers. Yes.
While doing your voiceovers, when you were watching TV for the first time, like heard your voice from the cartoon, like what was your first thought or like, reaction to that?
It's well, it's a little bizarre. It's a little bizarre because when your animation is such a, when you see your voice attached to a cartoon, it's a little bizarre because you stick out. You know, it's like your own voice. It's like I had the funniest experience with my 7-year-old son. I was in this was more of a movie. I did last year came out Beethoven's Christmas Adventure, Beethoven with the St. Bernard dog. And last year around Thanksgiving time, the movie came out. I was on Broadway at the time, actually doing Chicago, and so the DVD arrived at the house, and my wife and my son went downstairs into the meeting room there, and they plugged it in, and they sat down, and they watched it, but my wife never told him that I was in it. For no other reason than she just didn't mean anything, or she kind of, I think she probably thought that he knew. So as we're sitting down, or as they were sitting down and watching the film, about 10 minutes in, all of a sudden I come up on the screen, and my son turns to my wife and says, "Oh, Mommy, look, it's John." So apparently John is the actor and Daddy is the guy that comes home. That's John. That's a little bizarre. But I love it. I really do. That's right, very much. Another question, yes?
How did you get into voiceovers? Like, what was the start?
Well, very simply for me, I mean, there are people that's the career that they pursue. And so they put demo tapes together and they send them out to agencies that are particularly strong in that area with a variety of characters that they do. And that's the way that they do it. For me, it came the other way. It came kind of in the back door. Once I started doing Jay Peterman with that kind of accentuated styling that I gave him, people started recognizing that voice and that style. And so they started either writing for that or they just wanted that sound for the character. So it was basically, but however, it gave me a very narrow range of what I did in terms of voice. There are people that I work with that can do any voice imaginable. I mean, they're that good and they're that facile, and the director from the booth can say, do this other character and I need to sound a little bit German or something. That's what I'm thinking of. And all of a sudden they just snap into this character. I go, it's like, they just, I mean, if you think of it as a quiver of arrows, they just have, it's all stuck full of these other characters that they kind of fall. So if that's an area if it's an area that you like, play around with your voice, play around. I mean, I made a career of playing around with my voice. I mean, I sound like every DJ you've ever heard. I know. But when I was growing up, I used to play around with my voice all the time, trying to sound like this, whatever. And if you're going to be a voice actor, you got to have a wide variety of voices that you can do. Another question? Yes.
When you think back on when you were growing up and you were dreaming and imagining what your career would be like as an actor, how did it match up with what actually happened with where you are today?
I exceeded my expectations, which means I can pass away at any time. For me, my dream was to be a working actor. I never saw beyond that. If I had been at the Guthrie Theater in Minnesota, if I had been down at South Coast Repertory as just somebody in a rep company that was just going to do a play after play, I would have been very happy. So my vision at the time was to be a working actor. The different elements of that came as I still let my imagination work upon where I was at the time. My imagination has taken me in some odd places. I mean, I don't have the kind of just done stage work, or an actor who's just done film or television. I've just gone all over the place, and mostly because I believe that my imagination tells me what I have to do next. I started composing back when I was 4 years old, a year older than when I knew I was going to be an actor. But I just started writing melodies in my head. And they sat there for a long, long time until I realized at one point they were going to die there until I put them down. And so I taught myself, I'm a self-taught pianist because I don't read music very well. And I can only play what I've written. And so I have been composing for the last 8 years, and I have several CDs out of the music that I've done, but they're all thematic compositions with an electronic cello behind the piano and everything. So it's a different sound, but it was, again, it's the result of my imagination. At one point I realized that I was going to write a book. I'd never written a book before, but the instinct told me I needed to write a book about what I was imagining at the time, which was that dogs teach us everything we need to learn in life. And so I wrote the book, Before Your Dog. Actually, the first one was titled, It's Okay to Miss the Bed on the First Jump, and the other life lessons I've learned from my dogs. And it was a bestseller in the New York Times. But again, it results of what I imagine. So I say, if you value what you imagine, it will never lead you astray. And so, but I do tell you, I have overachieved. I'm well beyond what I thought I would accomplish. Questions? Yes?
How was your experience on Family Feud?
Loved it. I had 4 wonderful years on that show. I really did. And what I loved about that show, it taught me a discipline that you only get when you're the host and there's nothing else there. Because there are no writers, and the show is not live to tape. And you have to do what I referred to before, is leap and know that the net will appear. And know that the people that you have on the show are the two families. The questions that you ask, and somewhere in that environment it's going to be a fun time. So I always used to think of it as a cocktail party, and that these were my guests. And I never took it any more serious than that. But it gave me a really wonderful sense of calm, of just being out there with a microphone, and just kind of working off the cuff, and trusting that whatever I had up here would be smart enough to react on the moment. Or not, but that was okay too. But if not, then just keep the game moving. But it taught me some wonderful things, and I had a great experience with it. And sadly, they were moving the show to Orlando, so that's why I had to jump ship, because I'm still a dad. So more important that I be a dad than a game show host. So I had to bequeath it, and Steve Harvey's doing a great, he's doing a fabulous job. It's done very, very well. Questions? There was one, I interrupted somebody's question over here, and they saw her hand go up. No?
I have one.
Oh, one more here. Yes.
Do you have any tips on actually becoming a character and disregarding the judgments you make maybe about yourself or worries about what other people are thinking? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you mean. When I develop a character, I proceed from 2 things. What do I love? And what makes me lovable? Because I believe that every character has to have both of those elements. I have to know what I love. Now, maybe what I love is not a good thing. It may be a very evil thing, in fact. But it's what I love as the character. And I also have to think about what makes me lovable. What makes me lovable is what makes me fragile. And so every monster that I play, every villain that I play, has to have a moment of an Achilles heel, and you have to find out what that is. And if you learn the 2 things of what you love, it'll keep you driving towards what you need to get, which is the essence of performing. But you also have to color it with, I can't let the audience feel that I'm going to make it without them. Somehow, I have to have them invest in me. So I've got to show them something of me. I'm not so sure of myself. Billy Flynn is a good example of that. I've watched him play a lot of times. And I think actors have a tendency to take a character like that and make him very monochromatic. He's slick, He's quick, he's elegant, he's witty, he just walks all the way through the role like that. But the audience, therefore, doesn't invest anything because he has everything he needs to get from point A to point Z very quickly. But if you have a moment or two of vulnerability where all of a sudden the game changes and it's like, and you got to find that. Because at that moment the audience goes, ooh, wow, he's not so sure of himself anymore, is he? That's the way to approach a character for me. Find out what you love and find out what makes you lovable. Where's the fragility in that character? It'll give you the freedom to try it. I hope that helps. Yes?
Is it hard being on tour, like, with the family?
Yes, it's terrible. That's all I can tell you. It's terrible. I miss my son drastically, I can tell you. And my wife as well. It's just, but it is the way it is. That's the way, that's the job that we chose. So it goes. So, well, not big boy. It's what I have to do. But, for many years, they were able to travel with me. But now that he's in first grade, as I like to say, he's a previous academic commitment. Any other questions? Yes.
Have there been any other dream roles that you wish you could have played throughout your years, being Billy Flynn and King Arthur? Are there any roles that stood out? Say, wow, I'd love to play that role.
Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. I don't know if you know the show very well. It's on a tour. I was actually supposed to do that right after I did my first run of Chicago. I unfortunately had to go back at the time to film like 14 weeks of Family Feud. So in the interim, they put in somebody to hold the role open for me, so when I finished, I would come back out. And I don't know what he did to it, but he closed that show. Right after John Lithgow left, it was in great shape, and then they put this guy in, and the box office went down. So I never got to do the show, but I tell you, it was a dream role, and one of the funniest shows I have seen. There are two roles that I would like to do that I have not done. And I've not done them for the reason that it's a question of being old enough to carry the weight of the character, the psychological weight of the character. One is the psychiatrist in the play Equus, Peter Shaffer. I regard it as maybe the best play that was ever written in the 20th century. And certainly he is the most gifted writer, I believe. If you've never read it, it's anything that Peter Shaffer wrote. Is just remarkable. I mean, he's just, Amadeus is another one of you. Remember some of the other works that he did. He's a remarkable author and should be read and performed. And it's a great acting class piece as well. The third is that I'd like to resurrect the musical Man of Melange. To me, it's a timeless piece. The story of Don Quixote that includes the wonderful music of the likes of which is The Impossible Dream and other great pieces of music. And I think it's one of the purest musicals. It's on my list of the 5 great musicals ever written, and I would love to go back. And I think I'm old enough to understand Don Quixote right now, as I think I'm old enough to understand Dysart and Equus. So those are the two that I think I'd like to do. Good question. Thank you. Question? Yes?
What was the best piece of advice or lesson that you had learned when you had to move back home for that span of time with your parents?
I think I hadn't really absorbed that kind of fire in the belly yet. And I think that was the problem and why I turned and, ran screaming from New York and towards my parents' basement to live there. I think again it was that sense of my friend's passing that made me think to have the experience of such a great individual in your life and not to do something about it is to have the experience of him and totally miss the meaning. So that thought, I think, was probably what drove me back to redirect my life. Is that somehow out of that tragedy I had to make some sort of winning decision. Or it would have just gone on and I'd be an old and bitter man right now. But in public relations. And not that that's not a lovely career. That's wonderful for us and not obviously. Someone else have a question? Yes?
What's the craziest thing you've ever had to wear, like a costume or makeup?
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, in that first play that I did called Eternal Love, the medieval musical, there's nothing more toe-tapping than the music from the 1300s. In that period of time, that musical, as I said, was one of the worst ever done in the history of Broadway. And one night, as you know, on Monday night theaters are closed. On Tuesday night, the costumes come back because they've been over at the dry cleaners across the bridge in New Jersey. And we were wearing tunics down to here, and we had little curly shoes that they apparently wore back in the 1300s. Connecting those with leggings that we wore. And at 5 minutes to 8, everybody put on their tunics and their curly shoes, and everybody started looking for the leggings. They were back over the bridge in New Jersey. So at 8 o'clock, a cast of dancers, women and men, had to go on stage with no leggings. And if you can imagine what these little white curly-haired legs look like in New York City, and everybody went on stage with these bare legs and did an opening number that would rival Springtime for Hitler. It was one of the silliest moments I've ever had on stage. So it's not what I was wearing, it's what I wasn't wearing. I remember so bad. But I'll tell you another story is that I did a lot of commercial work back then. Actors survived on the commercials they did in addition to their stage work. And I remember back in 1984 going in for an audition for toilet paper. And I sat in a room in a chair while I had 3 very, very important people from an advertising agency who were sitting there with their arms crossed and looking at me very intently and taking notes, while a man stood on top of a ladder and he bounced rolls of toilet paper off my head to gauge my reaction on how soft the roll of toilet paper was. I did not get respond. Questions, anyone? Oh, yes, my dear, yes, yes.
Since Mr. Peterman is one of my favorite characters, I wanted to know how much of that was completely for invention, or how much a director, the writers, how they played. Did they tell you what this character was when you auditioned for it? Or?
Well, I never auditioned for it. I'll tell you the funny story. What actually happened was I was doing a show on ABC at the time. It was called A Whole New Ball Game. Corbin Burnson and I from LA Law. We were doing this very funny comedy. We lasted 3/4 of the season. ABC called one morning and said, "Don't bother to come to work, we pulled the plug." So I went out to dinner that night with my manager, crying in my beer and trying to take the cancellation as personally as I possibly could. And that night, the casting office over there at Seinfeld called and said, "We have this role on Seinfeld for John, and it's this kind of crazy character that we think you could kind of have a lot of fun with and chew it up and have fun." So originally I said to my manager, no. I said, no. I said, I kind of look at my wounds here, and I don't want to go guest star on somebody else's show after I just lost mine. I said, I'm just not in a good mood for it. Well, he didn't tell me, no. He called me in the morning, he says, "Get up, just go over and have some fun, blow it out of your system." So I went over there, and what they handed me was the J. Peterman catalog. They hadn't completed the script yet. And they said, "At the table reading today, we just wanted to sound the way the catalog is written." And for those of you who don't know what the J. Peterman catalog is, it's a real company. And they have these pastel drawings of the merchandise accompanied by these long Hemingway-style adventure stories about an Oxford button-down and climbing K2 in my Oxford button-down, and along with a price and size and availability. So when I read it, I said, well, to me in my head it sounds a little bit like a 40s radio drama combined with a little bit of a bad Charles Perrault. And so that really was the genesis of the character. And they had no idea what they wanted. They just said, do something fun with it. And so I just created this man who really was a legend in his own mind. And as time went on and they wrote the character, they became more and more in love with the characters. The writers responded to it immediately because it gave them a chance to write in long form rather than just little single, back and forth dialogue. And it gave him a chance to be poetic and expansive, and they just had more fun with that character. And also they had no limits as to what Peterman could do, because he became literally the corporate Mr. Magoo. He was an absolutely raving lunatic. I mean, there was nothing he wouldn't do or say. He had no self-edit button. So it became a real fun character. But they really, in the beginning, had no idea what they wanted. It was just a case of, and that's always the way Seinfeld was. If you sculpt something and it's interesting enough, they'll keep it. And they did. The PS to that story was that 1 year after Seinfeld ended, I bought the J. Peterman company, so today I actually own it with the real J. Peterman. So if you go to jpeterman.com and see the merchandise and actually buy something, thank you very much. Questions at all?
I didn't know we were over
Oh, we are. It's
time
fine.
because I was having such a good time.
So was I. And besides, we're happy aren't we here?
I think we're unique and fabulous and very.
Hold on a second. That was very sweet of you.
Really.
Say, no. I just wanted you to say that into the microphone.
Unique, fabulous. A man of positive, polite, deep philosophy. You really unusual. I admire him very much. And I love J. Peterman. This is a gift to us. And I know that Naomi will stay for, she will be around as we're going to do our woman's vocal audition. And I'll reiterate again, I'm amazed and very grateful that Jonathan Hurley would give us this time, and I emphasize give and redeem. So, do we have deputies? We actually share the power. Do I have deputies here? I think we have this wonderful gift for you both. Come here, deputies. As I was racing around, I forgot to prepare this. So, don't look. Don't look. You can figure out which one knows to do. But while you're killing yourselves on stage and rehearsing and trying to stay warm, you can think of a place in America, the belly button of America, that produces lots of performers on either coast that really loves you. And we will never forget that you're over here. We're very, very grateful. Can we give them a hand?
I never thought that applause was actually singular.
Okay, so we present this fabulous gift.
Thank you so much for coming.